In the early hours of a summer morning in the ancient city of Ephesus, sometime in the 1st century before the Common Era, the streets were already silent. Incense drifted through marble corridors as temple doors closed behind a small group of women led inward, away from public view. Outside, the city prepared for another ordinary day of trade and prayer. Inside, a different reality, governed by ritual, authority, and fear, took hold. These women had been selected, not by chance, but by decree. Their lives were no longer their own. In societies where divine law and human power were indistinguishable, obedience was enforced not with chaos, but with ceremony. The calm was deliberate, the silence was intentional.
And the suffering that followed was designed to leave no visible trace. Stories like this are why dark inquest history exists, to examine what official records praised and what they deliberately refused to describe. Within the first moments of this story, the subject must be named clearly, because history itself tried to obscure it. This investigation examines what ancient priests did to chosen virgins and why, for many of those women, survival meant a fate worse than death. To understand how this was possible, we must step back into a world where belief systems were not private convictions, but instruments of governance. In many ancient civilizations, across the Mediterranean, the Near East, and parts of South Asia, religion was inseparable from law.
Priests did not merely interpret the will of the gods, they enforced it. Kings deferred to temples, armies marched under sacred banners, and women, especially those without political protection, existed at the lowest tier of that hierarchy. Virginity in these societies was not a personal state, it was a resource, a symbol of purity that institutions claimed ownership over. Once labeled as sacred, a woman ceased to belong to her family, her community, or herself. She belonged to the temple. The women chosen for this role were often selected young, but always described as suitable, compliant, and ritually acceptable. Official texts praised the honor of selection. They spoke of divine favor, of families rewarded with prestige.
What they did not record were the conditions attached to that honor, or the irreversible consequences that followed acceptance. These women were removed from ordinary life. Their names disappeared from census lists. Their futures were rewritten in administrative language that reduced them to functions rather than people. In many cases, the transition was permanent. Leaving the temple was not an option. Questioning the role was treated as defiance against the gods themselves. Inside these sacred institutions, daily existence was governed by rules that allowed no appeal. Silence was enforced. Contact with the outside world was restricted. Movement was monitored. Every action carried symbolic weight, and every perceived failure invited punishment, though the nature of that punishment was rarely described directly in surviving sources.
What we do know comes from fragments, from later legal disputes, from sudden gaps in family records, from the anxious tone of secondary accounts written generations later, when societies had already begun to distance themselves from earlier practices. The central contradiction was this: these women were declared sacred, yet denied autonomy, revered in public, controlled in private. Their bodies were treated as vessels of divine order, while their voices were erased from historical memory. As religious power consolidated, priestly classes gained authority that extended far beyond ritual. They controlled land, labor, and moral legitimacy. In such systems, challenging a priest was equivalent to challenging the universe itself.
For women bound by vows they did not freely choose, this imbalance was absolute. The conditions imposed upon them were framed as spiritual discipline, extended isolation,
exhausting routines, constant surveillance, expectations of emotional detachment. Any sign of resistance could be interpreted as impurity, a dangerous accusation in a culture obsessed with ritual perfection. Punishments, when they occurred, were hidden, described euphemistically as correction, purification, or divine judgment. The language was careful. It protected the institution, not the individual. And because these women were considered offerings rather than citizens, there was no legal mechanism to defend them. Fear became structural.
It was reinforced daily through warnings, stories of past failures, and the visible absence of those who had fallen out of favor. A sealed chamber, an extinguished lamp, a name never spoken again. These symbols communicated consequences more effectively than violence ever could. Families, once proud of their association with the temple, often found themselves powerless to intervene. The same belief system that elevated their status also justified their silence. To object was to risk social exile or religious condemnation. Many chose compliance, convincing themselves that sacrifice was necessary for communal stability. As generations passed, these practices normalized. Young women grew up hearing the same narratives, that obedience was virtue, that endurance was holy, that suffering served a purpose beyond comprehension.
When selection came, resistance felt not only dangerous but unimaginable. Yet beneath the surface of official devotion, unease persisted. Archaeological evidence reveals temples redesigned to restrict visibility, administrative reforms that tightened control, laws that quietly transferred accountability away from religious authorities. These changes suggest not harmony but anxiety, an awareness that what was happening could not withstand scrutiny. The deeper injustice lay not only in what these women endured, but in how thoroughly their experiences were erased. Their labor sustained institutions. Their compliance upheld doctrine. Their absence after service ended raised no questions in public discourse.
This pattern was not isolated to one culture or one era. Variations appeared wherever religious authority went unchecked. Different names, different rituals, the same underlying structure: power centralized, dissent silenced, and suffering reframed as sanctity. By the time later historians attempted to record these systems, much had already been sanitized. Priestly orders described as benevolent, rituals reframed as symbolic, the women themselves reduced to abstract roles, stripped of emotion, fear, or agency. But history leaves traces even when it tries to forget, and as this investigation continues, those traces grow harder to ignore. If uncovering what institutions once justified in the name of holiness matters to you, continue this examination with Dark Inquest History.
This is only the beginning. By the height of these temple systems, the process had become formalized, bureaucratic, and carefully insulated from outside scrutiny. Selection was no longer presented as coercion, it was framed as destiny. Records describe consultations with omens, inventories of lineage, and assessments of ritual suitability. What those records do not show is consent. The absence is telling. Once chosen, the women entered a controlled environment where time itself was regulated. Days were structured around repetitive ceremonial labor. Nights were marked by isolation and vigilance. Privacy was nearly non-existent, yet meaningful human connection was discouraged. The purpose was not only ritual performance, but transformation, reshaping identity until the individual no longer thought of herself as separate from the institution.
This psychological reshaping was reinforced through language. Titles replaced names, personal history was discouraged, emotions were categorized as weaknesses to be managed rather than expressions to be understood. Over time, many internalized these rules, not because they believed them, but because survival required adaptation.
The priests who oversaw these systems occupied a unique position. They were intermediaries between the divine and the civic world. Their authority was rarely questioned because it was presented as sacred rather than political. This distinction protected them. Any challenge could be dismissed as ignorance or impiety. Oversight mechanisms existed in theory, but in practice they were circular.
Temples investigated themselves. Complaints were handled internally. Outcomes were rarely documented. The structure ensured that responsibility never left the institution. As pressure increased, so did the consequences for perceived failure. Ritual errors, emotional displays, or rumored disobedience were treated not as human responses, but as threats to cosmic balance. The punishment for such threats was described in abstract terms: removal, correction, purification. The lack of detail was intentional. Those who disappeared from temple life did so quietly. No public acknowledgement, no explanation. Their absence was absorbed into routine. Others were instructed not to ask questions. Silence became a survival strategy.
This environment fostered a constant undercurrent of fear, not panic, but something more corrosive: anticipation. The awareness that one misstep could lead to irreversible consequences. That fear shaped behavior more effectively than force ever could. Outside the temples, society benefited from the appearance of order. Festivals continued, blessings were issued, crops were attributed to divine favor. The suffering behind closed doors remained invisible, protected by reverence and tradition. In some cultures, former temple women were eventually released, though rarely integrated. Their years of isolation left them disconnected from family and community. Skills valued outside the temple were absent.
Marriage prospects were limited. Independence was almost impossible. They carried stigma rather than honor. Whispers followed them. Their past was considered both sacred and dangerous. Many lived on the margins, supported quietly or forgotten entirely. Their stories rarely reached written records. What survived instead were idealized depictions. Art portrayed serene figures bathed in divine light. Inscriptions praised devotion and purity. These images were propaganda, not testimony. They reassured society that the system was benevolent. Yet cracks appeared over time. Legal reforms began to redefine religious authority. Philosophers questioned absolute obedience. Empires shifted, and with them priorities.
Practices once defended as essential were slowly abandoned or rebranded. But abandonment did not mean accountability. Institutions moved forward without addressing what had been done. The women who endured these systems were not compensated, acknowledged, or memorialized. Their experiences were treated as unfortunate necessities of a less enlightened age. Later historians often accepted these narratives at face value. They focused on theology, architecture, and ritual symbolism. Human cost was relegated to footnotes, if mentioned at all. This omission shaped modern understanding for centuries. Only through interdisciplinary study, combining archaeology, legal texts, and social analysis, have scholars begun to reconstruct what official histories avoided.
Patterns of control, discrepancies in records, sudden policy changes following unexplained incidents. These findings suggest that the system was never as stable as it appeared. Resistance existed, even if muted. Compliance was enforced, not freely given. And fear was the glue that held it together. Midway through this investigation, one truth becomes unavoidable. These practices persisted not because they were divinely mandated, but because they served power. They centralized authority. They controlled reproduction, labor, and moral legitimacy, and they did so at the expense of those least able to resist. Understanding this is not about condemning the past with modern values. It is about recognizing patterns that repeat whenever institutions operate without transparency or accountability.
If you believe examining these hidden structures matters and that silence should be questioned rather than accepted, continue this work with Dark Inquest History.
As we move toward the turning point of this story, the focus shifts from system to consequence, from structure to outcome, from control to collapse. As these systems matured, the cost of maintaining silence began to surface in subtle but undeniable ways. Temples that once projected certainty grew more restrictive, rules multiplied, access narrowed. The tighter the control became, the clearer it was that stability was no longer assumed but enforced. This was the phase where fear stopped being implicit and became procedural. Surveillance increased.
Reporting mechanisms encouraged internal accusations. Trust between women within the institution was quietly undermined, not through overt hostility, but through uncertainty. No one could be sure who was listening, or what might be interpreted as failure. The psychological toll of this environment was profound. Living under constant observation eroded any sense of inner safety. Identity fragmented. The self became something to be managed carefully, edited for acceptability. Over time, many stopped thinking in terms of past or future. Survival narrowed the focus to the present moment, the next instruction, the next ritual obligation. This narrowing was not accidental. It reduced the possibility of resistance.
People who cannot imagine alternatives rarely attempt escape. Yet, even in these conditions, moments of rupture occurred. Not revolts, but breakdowns. Errors that could not be explained away. Emotional collapses that disrupted ritual schedules. Instances where the human cost became impossible to fully conceal. When this happened, institutional response followed a familiar pattern. Responsibility was deflected upward toward the divine, or downward toward the individual. Never laterally, never toward the system itself. The woman was declared unfit. The ritual was said to have failed. The cause was framed as impurity, weakness, or cosmic displeasure. The resolution was always quiet. Doors closed.
Records ended. Names vanished. For those who remained, the lesson was unmistakable. The absence of explanation was itself a warning. It demonstrated that the institution did not need to justify its actions. Authority was self-validating. Outside observers occasionally sensed that something was wrong. Travelers recorded unease. Administrators noted inefficiencies. Philosophers questioned excess devotion. But without access to inner workings, suspicion rarely translated into reform. Over time, however, political realities shifted. Empires expanded and contracted. New legal frameworks emerged. Centralized states began to view independent religious authority as competition rather than support.
Temples were audited. Land holdings were reassessed. Privileges once assumed were renegotiated. It was during this transitional period that the most revealing changes occurred. Restrictions placed on priestly power, limits imposed on lifetime service, quiet encouragements to reinterpret older rituals as symbolic rather than literal. These adjustments were framed as progress, rarely were they acknowledged as corrections. What this reveals is crucial. Systems that claimed divine permanence proved flexible when power demanded it. Practices defended for centuries as sacred could be modified almost overnight when they became politically inconvenient. This flexibility exposes the original justification as contingent, not absolute.
For the women affected, these reforms came too late. Their lives had already been shaped by years of enforced obedience. Even when release was granted, reintegration remained elusive. The world they returned to no longer felt familiar, and often no longer wanted them. Their knowledge, shaped entirely by institutional life, had little value elsewhere. Their reputations were ambiguous, revered and feared in equal measure. Many lived quietly, dependent on charity or peripheral roles. Their suffering remained unspoken, because language for it did not exist. Cultural memory adjusted accordingly. As practices faded, stories softened. What had once been described as obligation became tradition. What had been enforced became voluntary in retelling.
The women themselves became symbols rather than subjects. This symbolic transformation completed the erasure. Once abstracted, their experiences could be discussed without discomfort. They became icons of devotion, not individuals who endured control. The darkest turning point of this history is not marked by a single event, but by this transition, when suffering is no longer denied, but aestheticized, when injustice is preserved as heritage rather than confronted as harm. By the time later generations looked back, the original realities were inaccessible, archives were incomplete, testimonies absent. The emotional truth survived only in inference, in the gaps between regulations, in the sudden endings of records, in the reforms that arrived without explanation.
What remains is a pattern that repeats across cultures and eras. Institutions that operate behind reverence. Systems that equate obedience with virtue. Structures that extract sacrifice from the powerless while insulating themselves from consequence. The women at the center of this story were not anomalies, they were indicators. Their treatment reveals how authority behaves when unchecked, and how easily suffering can be reframed as necessity. As we approach the end of this investigation, one final question remains. What does it mean to remember those who were never meant to be remembered? That answer lies not in judgment, but in acknowledgement. The aftermath of these systems was not collapse, but quiet absorption.
Temples adapted. Beliefs evolved. New rituals replaced old ones. What did not change was the absence of accountability. The institutions that once demanded absolute obedience continued forward, carrying prestige, land, and influence into new eras. The women did not. Their lives ended without record, not always in death, but in erasure. No monuments were raised for compliance. No archives preserved fear. History moved on, leaving behind polished narratives that spoke of devotion, while omitting the cost required to sustain it. What survives today is not testimony, but implication. Sudden reforms, discontinued practices, legal language carefully rewritten. These are not signs of enlightenment alone.
They are evidence of pressure, of systems retreating just far enough to endure. The true legacy of what ancient priests did to chosen virgins is not found in ritual texts or sacred art. It is found in the silence that followed, in the way suffering was absorbed into tradition and control was mistaken for holiness. Remembering this is not an act of condemnation, it is an act of correction. Because when history refuses to name what happened, power learns it can repeat itself. And when silence is mistaken for consent, injustice becomes doctrine. If preserving the memory of those history tried to erase matters to you, continue this work with dark inquest history. Not to sensationalize the past, but to prevent its darkest patterns from remaining invisible.